So hello and welcome back to The Next Big Thing. My name is Chris Caty, Global Head of Research at Wisdom Tree, and today I am joined by two guests from Bessemer Venture Partners, Lindsey Lee and Caty Ray, both Vice Presidents over at Bessemer Venture Partners. And I will note that Wisdom Tree does have a business relationship with BVP. We work with them on two distinct strategies, so just wanted to disclose that up front. Before we begin, I do need to state the following to clarify: the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of Wisdom Tree and Bessemer Venture Partners and are subject to change. Anything we present in this podcast is not intended to be relied upon as a forecast, research, nor as investment or tax advice. The information and opinions expressed in this podcast are not a recommendation, offer, or solicitation to buy or sell any securities, and reliance upon them is at the sole discretion of the listener. Please remember, past performance is no indication of future results. And so with that, we can get into the fun part of our discussion today. And the catalyst, the reason we're all here is every year Bessemer puts together a state of the cloud report. They put together a whole host of research. So anyone interested in the topics that we're going to cover today, we're going to cover cloud computing and AI and software as a service and all of this great stuff. I certainly would advise people to get in contact with Bessemer's website because there's new stuff being posted there all the time. The Cloud 100, an annual report, just actually came out recently on their website, and it's all freely available for everyone to see. But Lindsey and Caty, I think to get started, for those listeners who may not be as familiar with Bessemer and their story, I think maybe if we start there, it can kind of ground and give context to our discussion today.
Well, I'll start and then Lindsey fill in whatever I've missed. But maybe just for your listeners who aren't familiar with Bessemer, we are a global venture capital fund. We were started actually in the early 1900s, so we're one of the longest standing venture funds in the US, if not the longest standing, and have had the great pleasure of partnering with founders across all types of industries, software specifically and cloud in our most recent kind of iteration of the fund in our life cycle. But we invest from pre-seed all the way up to pre-IPO, and we invest globally. So I'm based out of our San Francisco office, as well as Lindsey, but we have offices all over the world, including in London, India, Israel, Hong Kong, and the East Coast of the United States. So that's a little bit about us. Lindsey, what did I miss?
No, the best part about Caty going first is you kind of just get to say what she said. The only thing I'll add is we are investing out of Fund 12 now, which is a $3.85 billion vehicle. We have about an $800 million overage fund, and then a new, $780 million private equity strategy called BVP Forge. And Bessemer announced relatively early in this kind of wave that we're committing $1 billion to funding early stage AI startups. And for us, that is true early stage despite the size of the fund, because to Caty's point, the goal is to meet founders as early as we possibly can and then support them through the entire journey and life cycle of growth.
I wonder, we at Wisdom Tree started working with Bessemer. It would have been 2019. So that's when our relationship began. And in 2019, the sort of intriguing thing here is it's not as though AI did not exist in 2019, but when we were speaking to various of your colleagues at BVP or speaking to investors in the market, the focus was nowhere near what it is today on AI. And when we were reading the previous incarnations of the State of the Cloud report, the focus was not necessarily as much on AI. So I'm curious from both of your perspectives, what is a good way to think about what's changed, say, on the journey that we've all collectively been on from, say, 2019 up till now, August of 2024, where every other word feels like it's AI.
I'm happy to start, and Caty definitely chime in. I actually joined the firm in 2019, and part of what we've done in general is this incredible retention of a really deeply research focused and kind of academic approach to venture, which I really love. And I think at the time, and actually that's why the subtitle to our report this year is Death to the Cloud, long live the cloud. I think in many ways, the markets that we've spent the last 30, 40 years studying will only continue to grow in size. And then at the same time, there are going to be tectonic shifts in new markets being created and the disruption of incumbents who fail to change during this time. And so I spent all my time in developer platforms. And even in 2019, folks on the team here had published the 9 to 10 major developer laws around what developer tooling will look like over the course of the next 10 years. I think the lowest hanging fruit happening in code generation and AI will obviously affect the workflows that are in place, but in many ways, it's thinking through all of the same things that developers continue to care about, which is frictionlessness. It's reducing silos between highly specialized teams. It's integration of systems and new AI products versus kind of the old way of doing things. And these changes feel like they're happening very quickly, but it's not going to be a complete overhaul of the system from day one. And so, Chris, to answer your question directly, I think all of this research that we've done over the last 10 years underpins our understanding of how AI will affect the world. And for us, at least, it gives us this kind of initial knowledge base to work off of. It's almost like the analogy I like to think of is, are people not going to need to know how to read and write in school? Well, no, presumably you need to know all of those things to effectively use AI. And we think about that the same way in terms of investing in the research that we've done.
It's similar. I was thinking about over the years the idea that at various points through history there was a value on doing certain kinds of math, either in your head or with pen and paper, and being a little quicker at it. And I remember, I'm not that old, but memorizing multiplication tables and that kind of thing. And you now sit there and realize all these tools are available to you. You don't really get much out of them if you don't also understand what a correct answer looks like or how to use the output. So I take your point 100%, but at the same time, there's sort of a different evolution that's occurred in the sense that it used to be society valued sort of one type of output with regards to math, and now doing math looks ultimate, whether you're taking an exam, evaluating financial various things, all sorts of elements here. They don't necessarily emphasize the human brain's capability to necessarily do the calculation. It's more about understanding the calculation and where you can ultimately take those insights. So as we look, what's been interesting, you mentioned the developer area and the developer ecosystem. It's been kind of funny in 2024 in the sense that I watched online Jensen Huang and GTC, and then there was Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference, and Microsoft had their version, and Dell had their version, and there was the Computex in Taiwan. It's sort of funny how developer ecosystems are becoming, blockbuster events, at least in some areas. It didn't necessarily, maybe I just wasn't following it, but it didn't necessarily feel like that has always been the case. So I'm curious what you guys are seeing as you're deeper into these ecosystems and recognizing that the importance of what developers are doing, and if they're choosing to use NVIDIA's structure, to use AMD, or to use some of these other platforms and options, because obviously then that leads to spending and the investment and everything that gets discussed on the earnings calls of some of the world's largest companies. So it does feel like, as an outsider, as I am, to the developer space and community, that something has shifted this year and developers are more front and center than they've ever been before.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first insight that we had, 10, 15 years ago was that developers have more budget and purchasing power than folks realize. And a top-down sale is not necessary to penetrate a developer platform across the enterprise. And so that led to a bunch of investments in Twilio, SendGrid, PagerDuty, Auth0, Launch Darkly down the road. And that the idea that something that might feel kind of niche or only addresses one specific pain point is actually large enough to build a standalone company on. And a big part of that is the power that these developers have within their organizations. I think to your point, the reason why they've come increasingly into the forefront is because, like I mentioned earlier, code generation just feels like absolute lowest hanging fruit for what's happening in AI right now. And Caty and her team have a great thesis on how this will affect things on the non-technical side with services and converting some of that usage into software, et cetera. But what we've done is we've taken a really kind of grounds up approach, which is to go and talk to CTOs outside and within the Bessemer portfolio and just ask, how has the full life cycle of software development changed, been augmented in the last 2 years? And that's looking at everything from deployment to code generation, feature testing, feature planning, code review, CI/CD, observability, SRE. Like there's all of these really highly specialized roles within organizations, and every single one of these teams uses siloed software or specialized software. And so our biggest question is just, where will these workflows stay the same? Where will they change, and where will they get overhauled completely in favor of either something more efficient or just getting rid of the stuff that developers hate to do? And again, our goal is to be less prescriptive about what the future might look like and more hard-headed about what the facts are today. I think the reality of the situation is productivity has increased by upwards of 30% for developers using some of these co-pilots, but AI still really struggles with reasoning and higher level algorithms. And I think we'll see a lot of improvement there in the coming years. But that's what I think gets people really excited is, can we have a world where humans only serve as code reviewers and have autonomous code gen agents do the rest of the stuff that's really mechanical and kind of boring? So that's what I think. I think that's why people are really excited about the opportunity that this market could become. And why you've seen the most amount of venture dollars deployed here, I think maybe than any other category in the last 2 years.
It would be intriguing to hear your perspective. You indicate code refactoring, and it sounds like sort of a monotonous thing that people in the space may not prefer to do. But I have to admit that I would not personally be able to explain exactly what it is or how an AI-oriented entrepreneur could basically say, I'm going to come in, I'm going to disrupt, and I'm going to be able to do it better. So I'd love to, if it's possible, I'd love to hear more of the story as to what it means to code refactor and ultimately how that can be done better or done effectively with AI.
Yeah, I think a really easy example is Cobalt is a really old language. A lot of incumbent software companies are built on this. As systems improve in nature, as they get faster, as they get written with newer languages, as there are more integrations into other systems, these things start to break, and it becomes harder and harder to manage really complex code bases, which is what you see in every large public software company today. Is engineers are like, I have no idea what somebody did in another part of the code base that broke my code, or vice versa. And it becomes really difficult to manage siloed information across teams. And then you have to refactor this old code into new code. And it's a really mechanical thing. They know exactly what they have to do, but it is tedious to go try to find bugs. It's tedious to test, okay, I wrote this new code, I think it works. Does it break other parts of the system? And what happens if it does? And then I have to go back and fix that and talk to other teams. And so what AI can do is it can give you not only the first iteration of what that new code might look like. And again, it still requires a human in the loop to go in and say, okay, I think this looks right. Let me make some changes. But it can also automate testing against other parts of the system to ensure that when you push code, that it's not going to break everything else that folks are working on. So I think that's a really easy way to think about how AI could make a meaningful difference in productivity in something that feels really simple. It's just one part of a developer's workflow, and yet the willingness to pay for that sort of software is really high.
And maybe just one thing to add to Lindsay's point that I think is kind of interesting about this example is the places that we're seeing AI really take off kind of at the start are places where there's an inherent labor constraint. So industries where you just can't find those people. And so AI is much more likely to be adopted because, it can do a repetitive, task autonomously. And you don't have to worry about losing that person or otherwise. And in the case of COBOL, it's really a developer language from, in my understanding, kind of the 70s and early 80s, and new developers aren't trained on it. And so the supply of people who are actually able to refactor COBOL code is rapidly diminishing. And so this is like a good use case for AI because all of a sudden you can take that specific knowledge and scale it across systems in a way where if there's a labor constraint, you're not able to otherwise.
That's exactly right.
Something from the State of the Cloud report that I personally, as a non-coder, I just sort of steered around it, admittedly, through high school and college, graduated college in 2006. So in some aspects forever ago, before we even had smartphones, but in some aspects also not that old. And so one of the things I'm personally curious about is what a reality looks like, and whether or not at a certain point it could be expected that I'm potentially writing in English language or speaking in English language, telling, a computer system to do a certain thing, and somehow that's getting converted into a certain coding language, and the computer is basically at least programming at a basic level based on me saying things in natural language. Is that the proper way when this idea of development capability being accessible to most of the population, is that the way to think of it? Basically, everyone has their own language. They type into a text box, and computers on the back end are converting that into software code.
I think that's exactly where we're moving. And there was a great paper published by Professor Malik at Wharton and a couple other folks on the effects of AI on BCG consultants. And what they found was two things that I found really interesting. The first is that everybody benefited from the use of AI. So that's top bucket consultants and bottom bucket consultants. They also found that the improvement of bottom bucket consultants was upwards of 47% versus something like, I'm going to misquote this for sure, but something like 12 to 15% for top bucket consultants. And so to me, the implication is twofold. And you're going to see this across performance of a variety of different roles, including developers, which is one, a rising tide lifts all boats, right? So all coding capabilities will improve, from people who have zero coding capability at all, but obviously can work through logic and reasoning, all the way to the senior developers, where their role will be akin something more to a code reviewer. And then also will push them to become more creative in the ways that they create value in an organization. Because there will still be a need to differentiate yourself within organizations. Over the long term. So how does this apply to developers? Well, we think one of two things could happen. One is this is going to affect everybody. I think everybody will have access to coding capabilities. And what this means is you're going to unlock an entire portion of the population who may have really creative ideas, but never had access to the ability to implement those ideas. I think the second thing is the average age of a software company founder will decrease over time. We talked a little bit about this in the State of the Cloud report, but the question then becomes, what is the trade-off of backing really young founders who may not be able to have the capabilities and wherewithal to manage teams at that age? The flip side of that is, well, maybe you can build a really successful company with way fewer employees. And that's kind of a metric that we're tracking, which is ARR per FTE. It's not revolutionary or new, but you're seeing a really steady increase of that figure in our AI native companies. And so these are some of the things that we think about, which is like the financial benefit versus the psychological, maybe trade-off or downside. And then I think ultimately, again, like the top level or the cream of the crop software developers today will only continue to find more ways to augment their roles, more creative or maybe harder problems to solve over time, because so much of the rudimentary mechanical work has been taken away from them. And then you also unlock the creativity of folks who may not have that technical skill set to start, but can now experiment in ways that was completely inaccessible before.
And something the listener might be thinking as we go through, because Wisdom Tree is a company that is predominantly in the public markets, and the intriguing thing about the journey that we've taken, say 2019, 2020, 2021, and it's detailed in some of the recent reports. The report I saw just published in August on Bessemer's website, thinking about the Cloud 100. And in some of those years, like 2020 and 2021, there was an IPO occurring almost all the time, and you would just be seeing these cool private companies suddenly becoming these cool public companies. If people are intrigued by these sort of developer ideas, in your based on what you see in the market, is this mostly stuff that is being covered today, 2024, by private companies, or are there examples out there of public companies? Just because I know in some of the recent years there hasn't been anywhere near as many IPOs. So either maybe those IPOs are bulking up to go public in years into the future here, or maybe the idea of a private company being private for longer is something that stays with us. Obviously impossible to say for sure, but if people are listening and they only have access to, say, public investment vehicles, and they think this developer idea is really cool, would they have any options?
Well, Chris, a public investor, I am not. So
Okay.
I'm hesitant to share any recommendations on that front. I will just say that Microsoft's Copilot is the single most revolutionary thing to happen in code generation today. But I also will say that, we asked a question in the State of the Cloud report, which was, if you had to pick one of three options, one is an incumbent solution is going to accrue the bulk of the value in developer platforms and AI. Two is the company does exist but is private, and perhaps we've seen it, perhaps we haven't, but it already has been founded. Or three, the most revolutionary thing to happen in developer platforms actually hasn't been founded yet. And the fund, Bessemer's internal investors are completely split on what that might look like. So I will not try to pontificate and predict the future. Like I said, my goal always is to be less prescriptive about what the future might look like. But Caty, I'd be curious to hear if you have a specific take on this, particularly from some of the vantage points that you guys spend time on.
Yeah, no, I mean, as Lindsey said, shouldn't take our stock advice, but I think if you're interested in the developer tooling trend and how AI is turbocharging developers, democratizing access, I think, as she mentioned, Microsoft, owns Copilot. They acquired GitHub, which is GitHub Copilot. We've been seeing that kind of across our portfolio, just the unprecedented efficiency gains in the engineering departments of our companies now that this Copilot model is really turbocharging them. And then obviously, Meta owns Llama. That's another way, as you think about what are some of the ways to kind of bet on the AI infra layer in public markets, that would be, one way that you could kind of play the trend as well. These foundation models are democratizing people's ability to build companies. As Lindsey mentioned, companies are now, you're able to start them, much more easily because a lot of these are publicly available and accessible, and these capabilities that are really mind-blowing for end customers, whether that be enterprises or individual consumers. The underlying infrastructure is available freely through models like Llama and others. So I think those would kind of be the two ways to play the trend.
No, excellent. And we definitely follow Meta. We follow Microsoft. It's always great to get a perspective from someone in the technology space and speaking to whether it's CTOs or developers, and indicating that vote of confidence, because we sort of feel as public investors, we would love even more information from Microsoft, whether it's the number of people that are using the $30 per user per month option on Microsoft Office, or how much money they're actually making. And you can kind of Google and find estimates and things like that, but you don't necessarily see the stats coming from Amy Hood and Satya Nadella, at least not yet, on the official earnings calls. But I do know it took a number of years before all these companies were disclosing, the specific cloud revenues for their cloud platforms, and now that's been done. So maybe it'll just take a couple of years before these companies are specifically disclosing the more direct AI revenues as we move forward. But the next topic that I know we wanted to make sure to discuss today, and it's a very interesting topic within the report, is this idea of vertical software solutions. So I guess it makes sense to start with the idea of what it is to think of a vertical software solution and how that might be compared to, say, a horizontal software solution, just to ground us appropriately in the space.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, maybe just definitionally, the way that we think about it is a vertical software solution is anything that is built, any core workflow platforms for a specific end industry. So for a vertical, let's say Procore is kind of the system of record for construction, for general contractors specifically within the construction supply chain. Toast, if you've ever gone to a restaurant and you've checked out on a Toast tablet, you've paid your bill. The restaurant not only uses Toast for paying your bill, but as well as for many of their other functions and really just running the core of their business. And so if you think about end industries, construction, government, yard services, you name it, that would be a vertical software solution. And the way that it differs from horizontal software solutions are things that anyone across industries use. So something like Salesforce is a horizontal software solution. Notion, Microsoft Office, et cetera. Those are really industry agnostic. And so we focus a lot at Bessemer on vertical software. And the guiding insight that we had about 15 years ago was that what makes vertical software really exciting from a venture perspective, because traditionally the idea had been, to be in venture, you have to back big businesses, and horizontal businesses like a Salesforce or otherwise are just inherently larger and have larger TAMs, as we say. But with vertical software, the insight that we had was you can build a really big business because you can actually, there's a number of things like, network effects, word of mouth, referential customer selling, where you can actually own a larger percentage of a smaller market. So there's a statistic out there. I think Salesforce, has about 20 or 30% of the CRM industry. But many of our vertical software, home run success stories, they can have upwards of 50, 60% of their market. And so that's kind of been how we view the two markets.
We definitely saw and appreciated the Toast story. That was something that I think was referenced in 2019, and then it went public. And it's a great example to go with because some of the topics, they end up a bit esoteric, but everyone's been to a restaurant. Everybody understands, wait staff and supply chain and needing to get the produce from somewhere, and sort of managing all these details. You start to think about it. You say, oh my God, this is crazy. And then thinking about what Toast has been able to do in that space, where you just also think how in various cities around the world, how many restaurants there are. It's very easy for people to concretely picture the benefit that software can bring. So yes, Toast has always been an exciting one for us.
Yeah, I don't envy restaurant owners. I love going to restaurants. I'm a restaurant enthusiast, but no part of me kind of envies all the complexity of running a restaurant business. So I think they're probably glad that Toast helps them.
So thinking about the ways in which, and it's funny how I don't know if Microsoft necessarily knew this or if it's just a coincidence, but in the report, the word Copilot, not in reference to Microsoft, is used in terms of thinking about how some of these systems ultimately work. And then it feels like the world is pushing, or at least pushing excitement around the idea of agentic systems. And I always hear sort of the travel version of the agent story, but I'm sure the agent story can apply to many things, not just travel. And then this idea of AI enabled services, but in the State of the Cloud report, it feels like it's basically how these companies are sort of designing the software so that it can best serve the end use case here. But I think it could be interesting to hear your take on copilots, agents, and sort of AI-enabled services.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So I'd say, one of the things that pushed us to kind of sit down and almost define what we're seeing in the market was when we did State of the Cloud in 2023, GPT-3 had been on the market for maybe about 5 or 6 months at that point. GPT-4 was just launching. And so we were seeing this kind of Cambrian explosion of AI businesses. But we were so early in the life cycle that it was almost hard to sort through and say, like, how are these businesses the same or different? And what frameworks can we use to really wrap our minds around them as investors? And so over the last year, increasingly, when we look at businesses and we're talking about them internally and we're evaluating their metrics, we have started using this basically three-part framework of co-pilots, agents, and then AI-enabled services. And really simply to think about them is co-pilots, the same way that Microsoft and GitHub uses the term. They are AI applications that sort of turbocharge users in the way that they're doing their business. So we have a company, Sixfold. It's a co-pilot for insurance underwriters. So if I am assessing your risk as an insurance underwriter and saying what type of policy, am I going to write Chris? What's relevant to know about him? Rather than me sorting through all this information manually, Sixfold automates a lot of that. And so it's really kind of this extension of that existing person and that existing headcount. That's different than agents. And the way that we're seeing agents is agents are actually wholesale replacing headcount. So let's say something like recruiting. A recruiter in a company may look on LinkedIn and send out cold inbound LinkedIn requests to people to say, hey, my company's hiring. Are you interested in this position? And that's actually a great use case for AI. As we touched on earlier, some of these markets are labor constrained, but the tasks are relatively repetitive to some extent. And so AI can very efficiently, kind of in a 24/7 always on capacity, do a lot of these kind of workflows, especially those around email, kind of basic repetitive processes and other written language, increasingly verbal language. We're seeing agents that are picking up the phone and answering on behalf of restaurants or auto body shops. And so in that way, you don't actually have to add incremental headcount, or you can instead use these agents to wholesale kind of run this portion of the process. And then the last business model is AI-enabled services. And so this is traditionally areas of spend that companies would outsource. So at Bessemer, we use outsourced legal services like most businesses in America. And so that's a type of spending where we're typically sending it outside of our company to humans who are doing some type of service for us. And so with AI-enabled services, thanks to AI, you can now productize and sort of softwaretize these services. And so we're calling those AI-enabled services. And so maybe one example from our portfolio, in case that's helpful, is a company called Even Up. And so they focus on creating demand packets in the personal injury space. So you slip and fall in Walmart, you reach out to a personal injury attorney, they would create kind of a document that documents everything that happened, who you are and what day was it and what were the medical damages, et cetera. And a lot of that work was traditionally done offshore. But thanks to AI, thanks to ingestion of language as well as generative prompting, so they can actually say, Chris was in a Walmart and he fell, and this is how it's impacted his quality of life, et cetera, et cetera. Now most of that process can be automated. And so Even Up is kind of the AI-enabled service for that, where most of that had traditionally been outsourced.
I'm wondering, because when you were describing the agent sort of case there and the idea of replacing headcounts, do you see entrepreneurs out there seeking to do anything in the cybersecurity space? We think about that a lot simply because whenever people are adopting this new stuff and using these new capabilities, it feels like in today's world, you almost have to be also thinking about, okay, I'm going to add this capability, but what are the security implications and the privacy implications? So I'm just wondering if when you're looking into some of these ideas, if you're seeing specific cybersecurity related entrepreneurs seeking to tackle those problems.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Lindsay can probably speak to more tangible examples, but we have a whole cyber team and they're focused exclusively right now on AI and often agentic applications of cybersecurity.
Yeah, I would say there's actually two distinctions of how we think about cyber and AI. One is how do you leverage AI to improve existing cybersecurity protocols? And so one example of that is, can we use AI to replace the SOC 2 agent so that you don't need somebody online 24/7 who are monitoring alerts? It only surfaces the things that are most important. Eventually, down the road, the agent can fix the things that are lower level and more mechanical in nature and only surfaces things that require human judgment. The other part of security or cybersecurity that we're thinking about is how do you then secure and manage these AI systems? That's going to require, we think, new forms of observability, new augmentation of, SRE units within organizations. And then most interestingly, I was speaking to one of our heads of engineering at one of our portfolio companies, and he was saying that we're also going to need to figure out a way to manage the agents in the same way that we have OKRs for humans, we have management systems in place for our performance reviews. And then how do we ensure that agents only act within the bounds that we ask them to act within? And so you want to retain some of this creativity in stochastic systems where you can't predict what they're going to do. You're actually like, hey, that's something that I hadn't thought of that you're really efficient at. And at the same time, right, a big question that our AI native or AI enabled companies are currently thinking about is their own customers' peace of mind. And so right now, and this is what the head of engineering told me that I thought was really intriguing, their customers are asking for insurance to say, hey, if your bot asks or acts outside of the bounds of what I've dictated or uploaded or told it that my policies are, who's responsible for that? And I think that's kind of the ultimate question right now. Is it a separate software system that the customers need to procure? Is it additional embedded security for the vendor? I think it's probably both and we haven't made any substantial investments in the space just yet, but it is something that we're watching very, very closely because we think as these systems evolve and get increasingly complex and need to be integrated into older systems, inevitably there will be quite a few winners or new categories being created in both kind of these categories that I've outlined within cyber.
Yeah, this idea of responsibility made me think of the case study. I think it was in Canada where there was an airline and somebody was asking about a refund, and the AI system basically gave the refund, but it was sort of citing the wrong policy, and we basically had to go through the whole court system, and ultimately, at least in that case, the company was responsible for. So similar how the company might be responsible if a person who works there does something, the company was responsible for the AI system in that instance, which it was an intriguing way to sort of think about that question of an AI system is quote unquote making decisions, and where does the responsibility end up lying? Now, another question as we get close to the close of our discussion today, which has been excellent. It sort of relates to what's been getting discussed for say the past 6 weeks, which is this idea of a lot of money is getting spent in the AI world. A lot of it goes towards NVIDIA chips and data centers and servers and electricity and cooling systems. and we hear about that all the time. But there is sort of this background, and some of the stats within the State of the Cloud report allude to where we could be going, where you almost think of these models, these big models that get discussed. You mentioned Llama, you mentioned Copilot and GPT and Gemini and Claude, and there's this whole list that we're all familiar with. But you then basically say building the applications on top of the models could be where the investor ultimately wants to live, even if today it may not, especially in public markets, it may not be the easiest place to live or to find opportunities. But in future years, if we think of where the majority of the value could be captured, it's looking like that is going to be an interesting place to look, building on top of these very, very large and expensive large language models. But I'd love to, for sort of our closing area here, think about and hear your perspectives on when we go into those, say, vertical AI systems, recognizing that this could be from an investment return and a margin and ultimately a payback type thought process. This is where things could get very interesting. The numbers could ultimately be eye-popping as we move forward.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think we have two kind of graphs in the deck in the State of the Cloud report that show funding of AI technology broken down by foundation models versus applications, as well as valuations of foundation models versus applications. And today, the foundation model funding and valuations really dwarf those of applications. And I think that the reason that we think applications are a really interesting place to invest, despite those graphs, is twofold. One, I think part of it is just where we are in the cycle. I think to some extent it's like putting the horse before the cart. The foundation models had to come first and create that base layer for the applications to then be built on top of. And so I think that to some extent there's like a point in time component happening here where we're really only a year and a half or 2 years into this kind of generative AI, revolution that we've been seeing. And then secondarily, the foundation models, there are a few of them today, but we think that the potential for AI applications will be much, much, much larger. So if you're going to, build vertical AI, there's kind of countless verticals that you can go after. If you're going to build AI-enabled services, there's kind of countless areas of services spend you can go after. And so we think that there's so much untapped potential today. And, one analysis that we did, well, maybe two analyses that we did, one of them was just looking at in the US, what does software spend account for as a component of US GDP, which is about like 1%. And what does business services spending account for as a percent of GDP, which was 12 to 13%. And so even today, if you believe that a lot of these business services can be productized, that represents, a 12 to 13x type opportunity. And then secondarily, what we looked at was in one example of two portfolio companies, a company Litify that I work with, which is traditional core SaaS for personal injury attorneys, and EvenUp, which I just referenced in your last question, which is an AI-enabled service for those same personal injury attorneys. What do their ACVs look like today? And what we were really surprised by is that even though EvenUp is much newer than Litify, they already represent about 80% of spend in those exact same customers. So traditionally, you would say each end industry can really have one big vertical software solution. You can only have one core workflow solution. It's sort of definitional in being a core workflow solution. And someone's willingness to spend, they may spend 50% of their software budget. A small business may spend, 30 or 50% of their software budget on a core workflow system. And all of a sudden, the ability to tap into these services, the ability for AI to replace workers or turbocharge workers means that there are these completely net new pools of spending that are being opened up. Companies don't have to justify, finding new budget. All of a sudden, it's the reallocation of existing budget that's going towards humans in places that can actually be software. And so we think that there's just huge potential in the application layer. And obviously the infrastructure layer is very exciting, and there's so much to be done there. And Bessemer has a wide number of investments, including kind of at the model layer and many other areas of infra. But we're particularly excited about vertical applications, at least on my team.
And yes, that chart and discussion in the report, and I certainly, like I was saying at the beginning, the reports that we've been talking about on BVP's website, they are live, they are freely available, anyone can see them. There's a lot of great graphics and charts and videos. It's truly done in a multimedia way, and one of the more impactful is the idea of thinking about software budgets and kind of where they are today, and thinking about services budgets and recognizing that what we could be dealing with here as a result of large language models and generative AI is a change in the way that people think about what software really is and the type of money that gets allocated to it. You don't know how long or when you're going to have those public investment opportunities that do purely that, but whether in today's world you're looking at some of the largest companies like your Metas and your Microsoft or certain other things, could be how we have to evolve with these trends. But I certainly want to thank Bessemer. I want to thank Lindsey and Caty for their time today, referencing this great report that came out a little bit ago. And truly thank all listeners that tune in regularly to the next big thing. Like we've said all this year, Mobeen, myself, and others at Wisdom Tree, we're going to keep trying to bring strong and impactful guests like we have today to keep discussing these technology topics as they continue to move forward. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you at our next episode. Take care.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, Chris.